Welcome to the Learning to Die podcast.
I'm Ian Doonican.
And I'm Kieran O'Regan.
How do I live when I know I must die?
We explore areas of philosophy, psychology, martial arts, culture, existential risk, history, society, religion, science, and anything else that seems of interest and relevance to answering that question.
We can only hope that some of what we learn might be of benefit to you too. Namaste, sapiens. The Death of Ivan Ilyich, which we'll probably have to cover now in a couple of sittings, but will we get started and get a half an hour of it under our belt?
Do you wanna cut this as a separate episode?
Yeah, I think I will, because it's an hour. I think we'll just cut it out and we'll call it Reflections on Fury and Wilder, and then we'll start doing this and we can stitch it in. We'll do Ivan Ilyich next week, but we can get started on it today if you want.
Yeah, class.
Yeah, that was good. I enjoyed that conversation. Andrew, who's on the message group with us, is going to give me a few privates as well, just to help me at the start, just to, get some one-on-one stuff so I don't develop bad habits. Because I'm really interested in learning the skill, like learning chess. I'm interested in the movement and the strategy and the whole lot. I find this I really enjoyed it, man. The last couple of weeks, I really enjoyed it. I'm going to keep going till I enjoy it, It's good fun. I really like that.
And I'd highly recommend just like watching good movers. Are you right-handed or left-handed? Right-handed?
I actually do both. So the guy yesterday was like, "What are you doing?" I said, "What do you mean? You keep switching. Why do you switch?" I said, "Don't know, just do." He goes, "Are you southpaw or orthodox?" I said, "Both, I think." I said, "It just makes sense for me to move." And I'm not very ambidextrous with any other thing. But when I box, I can go off both of them.
But you did karate and stuff as a young fella, didn't you?
Yeah, and I think that's what it's from.
Because you would have had to do forms off both sides, I'd imagine. And
then Japanese jiu-jitsu, the same thing as well. So I did karate for maybe about 2 or 3 years when I was a kid. And then I played rugby. And then obviously lots of running. And then from about the age of, 26, 27 to about 33, 34, Japanese jiu-jitsu. And that's very much both sides stances. And when I was doing that, I was doing sword, and that was both sides of stances as well, and changing stuff. So yeah, now when I box, I kept changing. And the guy that I was doing it with was like, "Oh, that's actually good," he says, "because I'm really bad with southpaws." And I just noticed then like how much I was better when I changed to southpaw. But obviously I was just getting fucking wrecked. Like I was so tired after just a few minutes of doing it, regardless of my, fitness. Like I'm swimming, 15 kilometers a week and doing jiu-jitsu. Like I train like average of 12 to 13 hours every week, So it's not like I'm unfit, but when you're learning a new skill or a new thing, it's just that whole new fitness,
Especially throwing punches, you can kind of get stiff. You can be stiff and kind of muscling things from the upper body a bit, and the arms get heavy and the shoulders get tense and stuff. And
see, I'm still recovering from that surgery as well. So my left side of my body is still not full back to full power. And so even yesterday when I was throwing punches, I could feel the nerves down the back of my arm and into my tricep, kind of towards the end of the session, just hitting the bag even really lightly. I could feel it. And then last night sitting on the couch, there's this kind of a band that runs from my neck, across my bicep over into my forearm. And last night I was kind of fucking jumping like that, And then when I went to bed last night, went to go take off my t-shirt and all down my lats start cramping and everything. I was like, fucking hell, man. It's just a complete different way of moving. And then I actually went to bed and I was thinking to myself, that's why I need to do it more, because in conjunction with swimming and jiu-jitsu and all that, if that's doing that to me, that's a good sign. It means I'm moving in different ways. And that's all what the surgeon recommended as well, was like, get as much movement into that as possible. It's going to take you up to 3 years for that to come back right because of your age. Once you're over 40, it's a 3-year recovery in total. So as much movement as possible. So yeah, it's good fun though.
Class, man.
All right, let's get a half an hour under our belt, because I need to go at 6:45. We'll go again. So make a mark here at about 75 minutes. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome back to Learning to Die podcast. This afternoon we are talking about the little book by Leo Tolstoy, the man who's famous for writing War and Peace, and Anna Karenina, and other such Russian literature works. Leo Tolstoy's book, The Death of Ivan Ilyich. That's what we're going to be discussing on this episode today, and maybe even over a few episodes, because although it's a short book, Kieran, I feel like you could talk about this book ad nauseum, and it's a brilliant precursor to Ernest Becker's work, which we discussed previously, written some nearly 100 years beforehand in 1886. Very short book, but very impactful as well. So maybe we'll start off with me asking you, Karen, when did you first come across this book? Because I know you read it before I did.
I heard about it I first came across it without actually reading it last April or May, when it was discussed in a bit of detail in a book called The Power of Meaning by Emily Esfahani Smith. It's a beautiful book, really nice. And she discussed it in that. And that's one I think you might enjoy, actually. It's a really, really, really good book.
What's her name? Emily
Esfahani. So it's Esfahani is her second name, and her third name is Smith. I think it's Emily Esfahani Smith.
Okay. I haven't heard of that book, yeah.
Yeah, I was blown away. I just saw it, and I happened to come across it in an Eason's, and I liked the name, look at the title, and it's
Eason's,
really.
I haven't heard of Eason's in years. Eason's is a bookshop in Ireland. We used to go there as kids to buy school books.
Yeah, comic books and shit. And so that's where I came across it. Was in her. Maybe I'd heard about it before that, but that's where I first came across someone discussing it.
Yeah.
And then I came across. I definitely came across it mentioned in other books over the years, but she discussed it well in that. And then I also came across Ralston College podcast did a audio version of it. And
that's the one I listened to. Absolutely brilliant. Stephen Blackwood, who you obviously interviewed on episode 12. Brilliant. You could listen to that man reading all day, couldn't you?
Oh, yeah. It's brilliant. He's
got a great voice.
Excellent voice. And so I listened to that, and but the richness of it just struck me, especially as it went on and later into the book. And I'm sure we're going to get into talking about the certain details and the certain kind of symbology in it that I'd love to discuss with you throughout the book, and what you think of it and my kind of interpretation of certain symbolic concepts in it. But then it was actually on my second listening / reading. So like, I found an online version that I could read, and then I'd listen to Blackwood as well, read it out loud while I was reading the online version, chapter by chapter.
Yeah.
So
that's good.
Yeah, it was really useful. So I could like copy and paste quotes out of it and certain things. So, but the richness of it, man, like you mentioned there, what's fascinating about this as well, just as a piece of literature, is that War and Peace is typically described as because it is one of the longest novels of all time, and it's so famous. And it's like but it's actually like, I think it might be the second longest novel. The longest novel actually ever is called In Search of Lost Time by Marcel Proust, whereas War and Peace is in Limerick anywhere where I grew up. It was like, maybe people were users. I don't know. It's maybe something just my dad said or whatever, but I just always remembered, fuck it, that's like War and Peace.
That's why I'm laughing. That's what I was thinking about straight away. I thought my old man going, what are you writing over there? War and Peace. Like,
yeah.
Or he said to me, what are you talking about? Like War and Peace there. Get to the fucking point. That's why I started laughing before. I was thinking the very same thing.
Yeah, because it's so long. So then it's the exact same. Maybe a generational thing, whatever. My father was the exact same. So it might have been my dad or mom. Like it was family members. I don't know what it was, but it's that same sentiment. But then this book is like the audio version is like 2.5 hours long that Steve reads out, which means that, and he reads at a really gentle cadence. So you could actually potentially read the whole thing in less than 2 hours, an hour and 40 minutes, hour and a half, maybe, if you actually just read it.
Yeah, but it's classified as novella, so a very small book, like a short. It's like a short story, really. Yeah,
and but fuck me, man, it's for how short it is, it's impossibly rich. It's impossibly rich. It's so deep, and it's so. I want to use the word disturbing or unsettling, but that almost makes it sound like a bad thing. But it's not. It's like it's stirring, maybe is a better word. like the emotions it elicits and how raw it can be under the surface.
So this is interesting because in the book, spoiler alert, Ivan dies. Ivan Ilyich dies. So it starts off in the book, obviously around his death, and then kind of goes back to the years prior and comes back full circle. So it's the great sort of the great book for people who want to hear the end first and then goes back and fills in the blanks. But what's interesting when I read it, Karen, is, and I've only read it recently, and I've read it on in a small book, and then listened to Stephen Blackwood. And it was only because Gordon Marino had discussed it, and you had discussed it. But Gordon, who we interviewed recently, who wrote that book on existentialism, the Kierkegaard expert, he obviously said to me, like, you got to read that book soon, and it came in the post and a couple of days later. But in the book, Ivan Ilyich dies at the age of 45 and I'm 43. So I think when you read it in your life, it's probably going to be interesting. And I think, like a lot of other great books, I think you can reread this book many times, depending on where you are in your life. A bit like the Book of Five Rings. This is one of those ones that I think you should probably revisit every few years. So I'm going to be interested to read it in a few years and see what I think of it.
Yeah, I think I was only the same thought occurred to me this morning when I was going back through notes that I wrote and everything. I was like, I was listening back to the end of it, the last half an hour or so. And while I was looking at this, I can send you on the link to the online version, chapter by chapter. We can include that in the show notes here as well. So someone else might want to do the same thing. If we actually should do that, is include the link to Ralston College audio version.
I have that link. I have that in the show notes, right?
Online. I'll send you on the link to the online chapter by chapter version as well, that I found if someone wants to do what I did and go through it, or just read it and not listen to it. But
so I'm also hoping, Kieran, I'm writing an essay on this book at the moment, my interpretation of it or what it means to me, which obviously we'll discuss in part today, but I'm hoping from our discussion I'll be able to add to it. So, I've got about I'm hoping to write kind of a short essay, somewhere between 6 and 10 pages, with lots of links in there as well over the next couple of weeks. So I've been working that over the last couple of weeks because it had such an impact on me. I've been trying to write down more of these things.
Can you describe that? So before we move on to the actual book, like you said that when we decided to actually do this, you'd said that it shook you, or it kind of it hit you hard. So what was that about? What could you describe that?
So there was four things that really hit me from this book. And these are kind of the organizing paragraphs initially or the organizing sections of this, which obviously then feed out into their things. So the four things in no particular order were: we will all die someday, and we don't know when or how this will occur. Secondly, living your life for your career and social status does little for your soul or your pleasure on this earth. Third, marrying for convenience and ease, having children and following steps that all others take may not be the best thing to do. And finally, above all, living life without meaning, ... is it worth it? They were the four things that really hit me at the moment. And I'm sure as I write more on this, and I've actually I said to you previously, I don't know if we've discussed on the podcast or off air, I find it difficult to write. And not because I find it difficult to write. I find it difficult to write after doing a lot of work all day, sitting where I sit predominantly at a laptop, doing analysis for data, writing emails to clients, working on research, reading stuff that's related to my work. I find it hard to go, oh, work's done, brush my hands off and then sit down and write for an hour, because I've just been sitting in the chair all day. So what I've been trying to do now is actually write in the evening freehand, and just make scribbly notes, doesn't matter what it's like. And then what I do is, once I have those thoughts organized, then I'll sit down and I'll try and carve out a half an hour or 45 minutes in mid-morning when I'm cognitively engaged. And I'll break up a couple of work sections, because I try to organize my work in 45-minute blocks so I can get a break and switch around. I can't really sit and do things all day anymore. And I'm more cognitively engaged between 7 a.m. and 12 a.m. In the afternoon, I just do kind of donkey's tasks and just do shit where I don't really have to think much, And so I've been writing freehand in a big notebook in the kitchen where there's lots of light into the backyard. and then I'll come back in and write it here the next day or a couple of days later. And I find that's been really helpful for kind of stimulating. And then once I start writing, I start thinking about different things as well. But anyway, back to the story. They were the four things that really hit me. And I think for me, sort of at the halfway point in my life, very good book to read, as I said about the Ernest Becker stuff. And I think it's a kind of a book that goes hand in glove with Becker. Because Becker kind of broke it down. This was like a story, obviously, which it is, but Becker broke it down then as a science, really, if you want to call it that, nearly 100 years later. But I found a lot of commonality between it. And I found myself at the end of the book, Kieran, being extremely sad for Ivan Ilyich. Like, I think if I knew the man, I probably would have shed a tear from him, if not more, because it was very sad. And and we'll obviously go back and delve into it more, but I just found that overall, the only person, and I forgot the guy's name, is the kind of attendant to him. Gerasim. He was the only man that kind of showed him any kind of kindness, I thought. His family just treated him like a fucking resource and didn't give a shit. That's how I felt. And maybe I didn't, maybe that's what I got over. And his wife was more worried about money, and his kids just want him to fucking die, really, and not be a pain in their arse anymore. That's what it felt like for me, reading between the lines.
But I think that's what I kind of thought of the first time I went through it. And but I think that the key theme, when I realized then, because the way that the wife is portrayed at the very start for me is almost like a kind of a gold digger kind of a person.
Yeah, the money grabbing about after the funeral.
And she's worried about the money at the funeral and stuff. And you're kind of in this mind where it's fascinating, though, having gone through it and then going back again. This is maybe a useful place to jump in, is that at the very start, I had this impression that the wife was not really that bothered and was putting on a kind of a show, especially because of the way that Tolstoy writes, where he really elegantly acknowledges the bizarre internal dialogues that we can have in ourselves and not realize that. So there's such a familiarity to the way that they were talking about, is it Peter or whatever, and the other lad who were basically trying to winking at each other about playing cards later on at the funeral. This kind of stuff. So they're at the funeral, and then we're kind of basically like, and then they're kind of like nodding at each other as if, look, I know you're supposed to come and play cards, but you might not get there now. Sure, fuck it, This kind of nonchalance, this kind of the way that we can be at a funeral. And I know this is like, but then not be totally
at
engaged
the funeral,
with what this actually is.
Yeah.
And not to be fully there with it, fully engaged with what the reality of this situation is entirely, which is someone who was around a few days ago is in a box and they don't have a pulse, and the reality of the depth of the human condition that's amongst different people in different ways at the funeral, depending on how closely related they were emotionally or bloodline wise to this person. And then to be listening to all this, and then to hear the wife, and then to hear your man, is it Peter talking about the kind of the springiness on the sofa, the kind of mundanity of the spring in the couch bouncing up and down, and how just kind of, and then the butler coming in and talking about the cost of the gravestone or the graveside or whatever. And it was all just very formal, and there was no real engagement with the reality of death. And then you had this, all amongst all of that, then you have the kind of wife asking about how much more money can she potentially get out of the government based on her husband having died and being a judge and working for the government. And then, so it's all presented as if it's all these formalities and no one really cared about him. And then there's something about, you get the first whisper of reality, of the reality of mortality and reality of animality, when she describes the pain that Ivan was in for the last few days before he died, and the screaming and the shouting and the pain. And then you hear your man, is it Peter? I hope I didn't get his name wrong now, but whichever was the main lad at the start who was sitting on the sofa with the bouncy spring.
I can't remember. Yeah, I remember that thing though. Yeah.
And then you hear, then all of a sudden he gets this kind of sick feeling. He gets this disturbing stirring that he doesn't know what to do with. When he hears about this, it's like the reality of what his mate, quote unquote, went through, his colleague went through in these final days. It hit him then that this was a real thing that's happening. Like the illusion was lifted. the veil was lifted on the formalities and the ritual formalities and social norms that surround death all of a sudden just dropped away, and the reality of human suffering and mortality hit him like a ton of bricks, and he didn't know what to do with it. And then he managed to get caught back up in the kind of not in the he kind of like managed to kind of pull the lens back over his eyes again then shortly afterwards. And with the wife, having gone back the second time, it's so fascinating the second time through, realizing that for me, that what I initially, because I remember thinking the first time, oh, she's like a gold digger person. But then I was also aware that actually by the end of it, my view was much more that she herself is in immense death denial, and she herself doesn't know what to do with her own mortality.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say. Yeah.
And that her and the kids, that they do care, but they can't acknowledge that they care, because then for them to acknowledge that they care would actually be to, one, expose themselves, that the more they allowed themselves to care, the more vulnerable they were making themselves to being hurt when he died, so that they were protecting themselves from the loss and the pain and the hurt of losing their husband / father. And that if the more vulnerable, the more they allowed themselves to connect with reality, the more vulnerable they were making themselves, the bigger the fall they were setting themselves up for when he did actually die. And the second thing was, for them to truly engage with what was happening would have meant that they themselves would have had to have dropped the death denial, to use Becker's language, the death denial tools that were part of their social norm, social conformity, dressing a certain way, acting a certain way, talking about the opera in a way that everyone else did, and the kind of conversation that everyone else talked about. You know, they would have had to drop the illusion themselves and deal with their own mortality and deal with their own inevitable death. So it's like the depth in this is unbelievable, because that's
that's exactly what I was kind of starting to write about. Is exactly to that point. I think there's an element there that she was being a gold digger, and all these things could be true at the same time. She could be simultaneously all these things, because one is, let's think about in the context that she didn't work, so she probably practically was worried about money, because it was like 150 years ago, right? And I know it's not a true story, but let's say for in the context of the story. So how was she going to make a living? So she was quite rightly to be worried about that, and she still had kids. So there's a practicality part of it. The second part is she came across like she was a gold digger. And the third thing, which I think is probably exactly what you're saying, which is probably more important, this again was another form of denial of death. The man is sitting in a fucking coffin dead, and she's talking about money and how much more she can get out. It's a distraction from what's going on. And the guy bouncing up and down on the fucking sofa with the spring going as well, again, it's a distraction. And it's this kind of black humor about the spring going on. And it's this kind of denial. It's like when people at a funeral, at a removal, like in Catholic, in Ireland, at a removal, people do that as well. People are kind of nodding across when they're at the removal of the service, like kind of giving the eyes, come on, we'll go and have a pint. And I think it's not so much that they don't care about the person, is they just don't know what to do. No matter how many times it's done, people don't know what to do. They don't know what to say. They don't know how to act. They don't know how to be around it, including myself. I've been in that situation as a young man. I had no fucking idea what to say or what to do. And I wanted to go in there, kind of tick the box, show my face, give my respects, but I wanted to get out as well, because I didn't want to deal with that. I didn't want to look at that. I didn't want to embrace it, because our society doesn't promote that. And I think to your point as well, about the death reminders, the denial of death, I think in actual fact, what happens is the more you run away from them, the worse they actually become. Yeah. And the other part about that as well is, his mates were at the funeral. Where was his mates in the days before he was dying, or the weeks? There was no mention of him coming around, really.
No.
You know, there was no mention of that going on. His wife and his kids were kind of like thinking he was just going to get better, that it was like, you know, he had a fucking sore toe nearly. And the more that went on, it's like the more they didn't want to know about, because there were, again, to what you said, that those death reminders really kind of push him the opposite way. So again, that's why I keep saying it's a book that's hand in glove with Becker. So it's really interesting that all of these things, these layers, rich layers of human behavior, are evident in this novella.
Yeah, and I think you summarized it beautifully there. That particular component of it, because so much of it, like, and what you think about this in terms of symbology. So, in terms of death denial and the whole theme, like we get into, like, even I've got some quotes here around even Ilyich ends up, like, so say for example, right, it was law school that he went to, and what is a better archetypal representation of enforced social conformity than the actual law?
Yeah.
You know, and then not only that, but he went on to become a judge, which is the person who implements enforced social conformity. So, like, the symbology in it, even around his career choice and what he went on to do, was based on the most archetypal symbolic representation of enforcing the norms of a society.
Yeah.
And that in itself is like this, the symbology, the richness. I didn't notice this the first time through.
Yeah, I didn't notice that. That's a good one. Yeah.
Oh my God, man. And I don't even know if Tolstoy meant that. You know, I think his subconscious could have come up with that shit. We can never know.
Yeah.
No, maybe there's some biographies of him that talk about this in his journal or whatever. But, and then even around things like let's say, you know, there was a time where he had this whatever, there was this kidney thing he had. And I can't remember what the vermiform kidney or whatever. You know, this made up some medical condition, right?
Yeah, because we never just so people know, we never know what he dies of.
No,
we never know. We never find out what he died of.
No, just this vermiform appendix or whatever it was called. Just there's some made up passing around his displaced kidney or floating kidney or whatever, and it's made up all these medical conditions. But, like, even around things like the fact that they were trying to find, so he had this pain and this suffering, and he was trying to find doctors and specialist doctors and all these different treatments and all these different, not even just doctors, but other types of holistic, whatever they were called, homeopathic, trying to find this. And think about then, right, as all these different things are like false prophets, they're like false idols, they're all like towers of Babel, to use religious terminology, because Tolstoy was a Christian. So
only recently, before he wrote this book.
Yeah. So all of these different treatments were actually for his pain of this weird illness that he didn't know what to do with, no one could figure out, no one would acknowledge it, because everyone else in society is in death denial as well. All these different medical treatments and homeopathy and all these things are all different ways of trying to cope with the crisis of meaning that results as a result of direct confrontation with death and the inevitability of death. That they're all standing for, to me, my interpretation of it, all these different medical treatments and all these different specialists are like almost different distractions. Do you know, like you hear like midlife crisis stuff, or some fella buys a Ferrari or whatever, you know, or some fella leaves his wife and gets a 25-year-old girlfriend somewhere. It's like, you know, they're all just like things that are distractions from the reality of mortality and animality. Do you know, they're like, that's what those different none of them work. They all work for a brief time and then they all fall apart, because none of them are directly dealing with the reality of life in the face of death, and what really justifies life in the face of death, and what is it that really facilitates the kind of life that you'd like to live more of. Like, how would you live if you genuinely confronted death? And none of these things, none of these doctors' treatments, which were the symbols for all these different shallow, hollow ways of dealing with the crisis of existential meaning that he had. And I think the richness of that's what the symbols meant to me. And then he even started, and then he even draws comparisons between the kind of fake authority that these doctors would bring in, these kind of authority, and the doctors themselves reminded him of his role as a judge and the kind of authority, and that they knew what they were doing, and, you know, they walk in like they knew the show. And so he was basically drawing parallels between his enforced social conformity as a judge in a really formal sense, as literally the law of the land, and then these other means of man-made attempts to cure a meaning crisis, a crisis in meaning. That it's all the same thing. They're all just man-made attempts to try and come up with some kind of a fiction or some kind of a story to deal with the crisis of meaning. But none of them are based on a handing of yourself over to something bigger than you are, which in his sense was the capital H, he, which being a Christian, it's his version of imitating Christ or God. But in a Becker sense, maybe it's much more a Spinozan sense. It's much more along the lines of the life force. So depending on what,
yes,
you know,
that it's interesting because as you were saying, I was thinking about the Mandalorian. This is the way, and no matter who you bring in, to help you out. So for a couple of things on that, I think number one, not everything can be cured, right, by external sources. No matter, some things are just unknown, and people just die for crazy reasons. Not everything is logical. And comparing it back to your comments about being a lawyer, I think law is very kind of clinical, black and white down the line. This is what happens. These are the steps, and we come with this outcome. Whereas what was happening to him wasn't like that. And he was looking to get that, finality, or that kind of, this is what it is. This is the treatment that will stop it. And then as it went on, that obviously didn't happen. So I think when I looked at that part of the book and thinking about that, I think it was very much about not everything can be cured by external factors or other people. And sometimes you just have your own shit to live with and deal with. And to quote the Mandalorian, or like the life force, this is the way. And Max Holloway, as he says in the UFC, it is what it is. And some things just can't be solved. That you have to live with. And all the fucking trying to find out and seek and understand, you may never find it. And
but
this
is just that by the end of it, he does, where he, even though he is in pain and seemingly from the outside in pain and groaning, that the way that it finishes, spoiler alert, but as Ian said, he dies, is that he has this kind of like coming to Jesus moment at the end, to use a Christian term, like, and where it's kind of like a realization of what's really important. And the fact that he has this kind of an element of redemption at the end, where he goes from absolutely hating his wife and hating his daughter and hating their youth and hating their vitality and hating their lies and hating their falsehoods and hating their own death denial, because in their death denial, in their denial of his situation, he could see what he had lived by for his entire life. He could see that that throughout, especially as he went to law school, is where he kind of starts breaking his life down towards the end of the book. He's like, at the beginning of law school, things were nice, and there was joy, and there was friendship, and there was play, and there was exploration, and there was optimism about the future. And then things got more and more serious, and then there was only glimpses of it every now and then. There was love for a woman, and there was certain moments. But then the older he got, the more he succumbed to denial of death, and the more he started just getting deeper and deeper, entrenching himself in social conformity and entrenching himself in his career in order to deny the fact of death. And then it's like this realization that the innocence of childhood was the only real pure joy and pure moments that he relished the most when he thought back, because that's where there was just an innocence and an openness, and like the power of that, the realization of the shallowness. But I suppose what I'm trying to say is like the switch that he made at the end, where he went from increasingly hating the people around him, except Gerasim, hating his wife, hating the doctor, hating his daughter, and because of their denial of his situation. And then I think, there's that all kind of Jungian concept of like that Jung took, where it's like shadow projection, what I most need to find is where I least want to look. And then a way of identifying the shadow is what, it says in like Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, where one of the characters says like, what I most hate in others is what I most fear in myself.
Yes.
So like what he was seeing in these people around him who are denying his situation, who are they themselves blinkering themselves from the reality of mortality by jumping into these social conformities and wearing certain clothes and dressing a certain way and putting on certain makeup and going to certain shows and repeating certain
patterns of behavior
statement about some opera singer, that it was just the same kind of conversation that always takes place, and no real original opinions about any of these, about the particular opera singer that they were going to go to see at the end. And he was just in that, he hated them so much because he saw his own his own reflection back in terms of denying the reality of life, denying the reality of death, and doing so by trying to drown yourself in social norms.
But that's what I was kind of saying at the start as well, Karen. I just want to read out a bit of a paragraph here as well on this point, because I think you're bang on the money here. I think people get into these kind of, I would say, lanes of life. And it's like, well, I live in this middle class suburb. I've got this job and I should have 2 kids and I should have the BMW and I should train for a triathlon on the weekend. And I should have a glass of wine on a Saturday night and I should be reading the coolest book that's on the bestseller list. And I should be watching this show on Netflix and I should be, learning the piano because everyone else is fucking doing it, right?
Can I give one example of that?
Yeah.
Is that even right there, I have a note made here that even when Ilyich was reading books, the books that he was reading were described as those that, quote, were much discussed at that time, close quote. But he was reading the books, not because they were the ones that were the most exciting to him, that explored the kind of ideas that he was most passionate and curious about. He was reading the books that society was telling him he should read, not the ones he thought that were actually exciting and full of the kind of ideas he wanted to explore. Like, it was just the archetypal representation that he presented of being this social conformist that denies the reality of life by drowning yourself in social norms is so rich, like throughout the whole thing. Like, it's
and this is exactly what I wrote here, Karen. How many people on their deathbed utter the words, I wished I worked more, I wish I made more money, and I wish I got that promotion? Because when you ask people, you look at people at the end of their life, that's not what they talk about. They talk about relationships, they talk about love, they talk about meaning. Whilst working, developing a career, and providing for yourself and your family, it is important that it must align with your values and your meaning in life. I recently discussed this with an experienced clinical psychologist, an elder of sorts in our community, and he said there are three key questions one must ask themselves. 1, who am I? 2, where am I going? And 3, who is coming with me? Now, this seems like easy questions, and to some degree they are. But when you think deeply about these, they're profoundly important questions to ask yourself to define one's direction in life, to recalibrate, and to periodically check your course in life. So who am I? Where am I going? And who is coming with me? And so, to your point, Karen, like, I could have fell into that trap. And I thought about myself. I could have fell into that trap 10 or 15 years ago, where I went and played tennis, people after work, did golf, didn't do martial arts, spoke about the coolest new bicycle that was out in the market, went to the AFL, all those things I didn't like. But I kept doing martial arts, reading different books, getting tattoos, leaving that job, doing different things. Not because I didn't want to be part of the social norm. It's not about that. It's because I chose paths of discovery for myself. I chose paths that really, were there for me to improve myself or to look at the aspects of myself. Like we spoke about with the box and stuff, you're shaping this thing out of granite. Now, whether I did that by design or I had that pure luck, or whether I'm just a rebel or I don't want to be part of society, I don't know. But I was kind of happy reading this book that I had gone off and explored many different options in my life from many different areas, because I don't seem to fit into those one lane or those tracks. And so for me, reading this, I found that Ivan Ilyich was trapped in one of those things and didn't get that until just before he died. And I kind of reflected on my own life and thought, fuck, at least I think I got some of this, because I know what's important to me in my life and where I'm going. I'd hate to be on my deathbed going, like Ivan Ilyich going, oh man. Because that's what I felt. I felt sorry for him at that stage. I thought, man, it's too late. You've got it before you die, but you're getting at the 11th hour on the 11th day. You're just, this is way too late, man. You're only 45 and you're going to die, and you've learned this right in your deathbed. Hopefully there's reincarnation, because you might come back and do it again and you might bring on that lesson. But you were so obsessed with the modern bullshit of the time.
I think there's a line towards the end that I fucking there's a line at the end that I took so many notes and quotes. There's a bit at the end that's just so raw. I'm sure we're going to go back into this again, but it got to do with his son. Yeah, he has a line here. He says, his mental sufferings were due to the fact that night, as he looked at Gerasim's sleepy, good-natured face with its prominent cheekbones, The question suddenly occurred to him: what if my whole life has been wrong?
Mm.
It occurred to him that what had appeared perfectly impossible before, namely that he had not spent his life as he should have done, might after all be true. It occurred to him that his scarcely perceptible attempts to struggle against what was considered good by the most highly placed people, those scarcely noticeable impulses which he had immediately suppressed, might have been the real thing, and all the rest false. And his professional duties and the whole arrangement of his life and of his family and all his social and official interests might have all been false. He tried to defend all those things to himself and suddenly felt the weakness of what he was defending, that there was nothing to defend. But if that is so, he said to himself, and I am leaving this life with the consciousness that I have lost all that was given to me and it is impossible to rectify it, what then? He lay on his back and began to pass his life in review in quite a new way. In the morning, when he saw his footman, then his wife, then his daughter, then the doctor, their every word and movement confirmed to him the awful truth that had been revealed to him during the night. In them, he saw himself, all that for which he had lived, and saw clearly that it was not real at all, but a terrible and huge deception which had hidden both life and death. This consciousness intensified his physical suffering tenfold. He groaned and tossed about and pulled at his clothing, which choked and stifled him, and he hated them on that account. This realization and the dying moments, like dying days, that he just lived a falsehood, that he just ticked boxes. He was one of these, like Kierkegaard called them, ordinary men who tranquilize themselves with the trivial.
Mm.
That they tranquilize them, that they tranquilize the depth of the passion of life with trivial social norms and ticking certain social boxes and wearing the right clothes. And just like you described, wearing the right clothes, reading the right books, listening to the right music, sporting the right teams, just doing all the things that are the right good things to do, because that's what you're supposed to do when you're in this particular social class or group or community or whatever.
Yeah.
And you're supposed to just stay in this lane now and do what you're told and tick these right boxes and everything's going to be grand and you're going to live forever. You know, you don't even think about the fact you're going to live forever, because you don't even think about the fact that you're going to die. That's not going to happen. Don't worry about it. So that happens to other people. That's why when I go to funerals, I can just wink at my mates and go and have a pint afterwards. Or just the representation here of how it is possible to just blinker yourself from the reality of life and from what's actually important is just, it's so deep, so rich. It's like, and I'm every time we go back to this, we're going to pick up new things.
Yeah. All right. We'll